Hello everyone, and welcome to our 9th video in our series on Dante's Inferno. Today we'll be continuing to cover Canto number 5, so do make sure that you've gone on to lesson, followed the link to Google Drive, and downloaded the worksheet for today. So as we continue with Canto 5, we're going to be going deeper into the second circle. Remember, Canto 5 takes place entirely in circle 2 of Dante's version of hell, meaning those who have committed the sin of lust. And today I want to focus on the following question. Dante and Virgil go deeper into the second circle of hell, meeting souls who were guilty of the sin of lust, trying to identify these historical people mentioned. So Dante, through means of Virgil, is going to introduce us to several historical, real-life figures who Dante the poet places in this second circle of hell. So see if you can identify them as we begin to read. So on the next few slides, we're going to read through lines 36 to 63 of Canto 5. You can follow along on page 749 and page 750 of your literature textbook. As winter starlings riding on their wings form crowded flocks, so spirits dip and veer, foundering in the wind's rough buffetings, upward or downward, driven here and there, with never ease from pain nor hope of rest. As changing cranes will form a line in air, so I saw souls come uttering cries, wind-tossed and lofted by the storm. Master, I cried, who are these people, by black air oppressed? First among these you wish to know, he said, was Empress of many tongues. She so embraced lechery that she decreed it justified legally to evade the scandal of her lust. She is that Semiramis of whom we read, successor and wife of Ninus. She possessed the lands the Sultan rules. Next, she who died by her own hand for love and broke her vow to Sychaeus' ashes. After her comes lewd and wanton Cleopatra. See Helen, too, who caused a cycle of many evil years. And great Achilles, the hero whom love slew in his last battle. Paris and Tristan are here. He pointed out by name 1,000 souls whom love had parted from our life, or more. When I heard my teacher tell the roles of knights and ladies of antiquity, pity overwhelmed me. So we begin our analysis by looking at the simile that Dante uses here in the beginning. And he's particularly trying to help us imagine the movement of these souls in this hurricane of hell that we discussed last time, right? This perpetual wind and storm that buffets these souls left and right. And he does so by drawing on the image of a winter starling. And I've placed the picture here for you on this slide to the right. And you'll notice that this bird is sitting on barbed wire. And barbed wire is very thin and small. So imagine how small this bird is in comparison. And Dante is saying that just as these starlings, when they try to fly in wind, are pushed together and they form one massive flock, so too do these spirits also get pushed and buffeted around by the rough nature of this hurricane of hell. And you'll remember that when we talked about the punishment that we see in each of these circles, it's an ironic twist on the sin they've committed in life. So just as they lacked control over their physical bodies in life, so they couldn't control their passions, in death, they also no longer have control over their physical bodies, and they're buffeted left and right by this wind. We see that this simile is getting continued then into this next tercet, so an extended simile, an epic simile, if you like. And we see that it's not just that they're thrown about, they're thrown left and right, up and down, and the pain that they endure from this movement never ceases, and they have no hope of rest. Remember the calling on the gate of hell, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And this includes the hope of even getting a moment's rest from the punishment they're forced to endure. Now we see that Dante switches to a new simile, and he's saying not only are they buffeted about by the wind, just as these small birds are, they also form a line in the air as chanting cranes. So really, you could replace this with any type of bird. If you see, for example, geese, or any flock that flies in this straight line pattern, this is the image we should be getting. So these souls are being whipped about by the wind. And as they come before Dante and Virgil, we see that they're forming this single file line. So again, Dante is simply trying to drive the point home that they lack no control. They don't get to choose where they go. They're all forced into this path of motion. Not only that, but we also see that they are crying as well, crying out from the pain that they are being forced to endure. And this evokes a particularly surprising response in Dante, and that is that he also cries out, and he cries to Virgil, and he asks him, who are these people by black air oppressed? Think about the color black and symbolically what that means in literature, meaning death or decay, this complete and utter lack of hope. So Dante is very much being impacted and affected by the environment around him. And that would be fine. It's okay to have this sense of empathy for others, right? But remember, Minos has warned Dante specifically, do not be fooled by these souls that you see in hell. Do not feel pity for them. And we see that Dante, even from the first moment he sees these souls, is not able to follow Minos' advice. And this is going to be particularly important as we begin to dive into these stories of these historical figures that we see in the second circle. And if we really pull back those basic layers of their tales, and we try to understand exactly what got them in this second circle in the first place, we too oftentimes will find ourselves in a place where Dante is, wanting to feel pity for the souls that we see here. And this is something that Dante the poet, through his writing, is cautioning us to be careful about. So turning then to your worksheet for this video, we haven't been introduced to any of the historical souls yet. But I do want to focus again on the description of the sinners that we see here and the punishment that's inflicted on them. So remember, here we've moved away from that first half of Canto V, where we see all of these souls come before Minos and then being sent to their respective circles. Now we're focusing particularly on those who have sinned in carnal things, meaning they've given into lust. And we see that their punishment here produces three effects. So one, this lack of control over their physical bodies that we've talked about, but also that there's no rest from this torment that they experience, not even for a moment, and that the intensity of the punishment being inflicted upon them produces these uttering cries. They have no control over the noises that they make. Jumping back then to getting our first look at these historical figures that we see. And here, Dante again is going to play a bit of that guessing game that he played when he introduced us to Virgil back in Canto I. So he drops hints about who these people might be, at least with our first two historical figures. In a sense, trying to get us to guess, because his audience would have been familiar with who these people were. So we then, as an audience coming at this text centuries later, need to do a little bit of digging to reach the same conclusion that they would have known. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the evidence that Dante gives us. And here he tells us that this first figure that Virgil identifies for him is known as the Empress of Many Tongues. Also, she is so well known for the way that she embraced or welcomed lechery, lechery meaning this unnatural sexual desire, that she decrees it or makes it justified. So she is the empress over this nation that we're going to talk about in a moment. And she is so unable to control her lustful desires that in order not to make it illegal, she changes the law to justify what she does. And here, through a little digging and thinking, we should come to the fact that this first figure that we see is going to be one of the queens over the ancient empire of Babylon. And we know that from this expression of emperors of many tongues, Babylon being well known for the story from the Old Testament on the Tower of Babel, meaning that all of these people come and they can speak many languages and they can communicate with one another, and they try to build this tower to reach up to the heavens. And God will look down upon this and see it as blasphemous, right? They're trying to place themselves in a higher position than God. And so his punishment for them not only is to destroy the tower, but to mix their languages so they no longer are able to understand one another. They all are speaking these different languages. Hence where we come to this expression, empress of many tongues, being a reference to Babylon. But now that I understand what location she is from, I need to look at these other hints that Dante gives me. So again, reiterating this fact that she legally changes the law to sort of make appropriate the things that she does. And here, in case we haven't gotten it yet, Dante gives us her name, and she is called Semiramis, and she specifically was the wife of Ninos. And after Ninos dies, she becomes queen of Babylon. And it's important that we understand our history, and your textbook does a good and brief job in part of doing this. So if you look on page 750, in the footnote for verses 50 to 51, we see that she was an Assyrian queen who was known widely for her sexual excesses, and that she took control after the death of her husband, Ninos. So one of the things that your textbook doesn't tell you is that she was known as a great ruler of Assyria, specifically of Babylon. But what she is remembered for, more often than not, is the more scandalous side of her story. And that's interesting too, is just a life lesson, to go on a bit of a foot away somewhere else, that oftentimes the things that we do in life, no matter how great they are, sometimes the world remembers us for the not so great things we have done. And we're going to see that for the entire list of people here that we're going to see, some of whom will be familiar to you. So now that we've come to our first figure, the first soul, who's condemned to this circle of hell, we come next to another guessing game. And here Dante is referring to someone who died by her own hand for love, meaning that she commits suicide out of this love that she feels for this person. But also at the same time that her love breaks her vow to Sychaeus' ashes. And this is going to be a huge tip for any who are reading, who are familiar particularly with Greek mythology. And for those of us who aren't, we need to then do extra research, and we look at our textbook, and we see that our textbook helps us out a lot here. So we're still on that same page, page 750. And in your footnote for these verses, we learn that this figure is in fact Dido, queen of Carthage. And her story is a particularly sad one. Just to give you a brief overview of it, she loses her husband. He is murdered, and she is so overcome by grief that she vows on his grave, right, referring to his ashes, that she will never fall in love again. She will never give her heart to anybody else. But then along comes Aeneas, the hero in Virgil's Aeneid. And he pursues her, and she ends up breaking her vow and falls madly in love with him. But when he remembers his mission, right, he needs to go on and be one of the heroes in the story. He cannot stay in Carthage. He leaves her, and she's overcome by her grief that she kills herself. Right? So all of this love that she gives him is for naught. They don't end up together. And then I want to highlight lewd here for a moment, because I want you to remember it as we jump after our next slide on that table to discussing our third soul. So we finally have come to some historical souls in this second circle of hell. The first is Queen of Assyria, Queen of Babylon, Semiramis. And her sin in particular is one that Virgil describes in very harsh terms, right? So she twists the law to legalize the things that she's done. Next we come to Dido, Queen of Carthage. And her sin, right, is breaking this vow of love that she makes on her husband's grave, and eventually committing suicide because the love that she's given to Aeneas is eventually betrayed. And now we come back to that third soul, and she should be very familiar to everyone watching, and that is Cleopatra. And I wanted you to remember this word lewd, and we're going to combine it with this word wanton. And this is describing the veracity or the intense nature of the passion that Cleopatra has. You'll know that not only was Cleopatra mistress to Julius Caesar, but also mistress to his best friend, Mark Antony. And so part of her rule, right, is tied in with her being seen as a sexual figure. Next, we come to Helen, and we should be able to guess in particular which Helen he means because of this reference to that cycle of many evil years. And everyone watching this video should know that here Dante is referring to Helen of Troy. And the many evil years that Dante is saying that she caused then would be the Trojan War. And I hope you've noticed up until now, so far Dante is only pointing out female historical figures. But men also find themselves here too. One in particular, again, we're very familiar with, is Achilles. And now some of you might be shaking your head and wondering, why is Achilles here? Because in our reading of the Iliad, we never see any deep romantic love connection with Achilles. He only seems to treat women as war prizes. But in certain portions of the Iliad and stories revolving around Achilles, there is one tale in particular that talks about how he falls madly in love with the daughter of King Priam, right? So think sister to Prince Hector and Prince Paris. And he goes out to meet her. And he does so by abandoning the Greek troops. He basically essentially says, I've fallen in love with her, I'm leaving you guys, good luck. And he leaves and goes to pursue her. And in the process, he is found by Paris and he is killed. And this is how he meets his end, right? So again, we're introduced now to three more figures who find themselves here. I think it's also interesting to note that the pace here picks up of how Dante chooses to introduce these figures. And this is going to reflect the quick pace at which we notice souls flooding into this circle in particular, right? Meaning that this is a sin that Dante would have seen as one that was particularly prevalent in his times. Then we come to the last two figures that Dante is going to mention by name. And these are Paris and Tristan. And Paris you should be familiar with again. So we have three people from Homer's The Iliad who have wound up in this circle. Right? Remember that Paris's sin in particular is that he, in fact, is the one who steals or takes Helen away from her rightful husband. Tristan, however, might be someone who not everyone is familiar with. So again, we need to turn back to our textbook on page 750 and look at the footnote for verse 58. And it tells us here that Tristan, a hero from medieval romances, had a love affair with his uncle's bride. And now, before people start making weird faces or getting super disgusted, I want to clarify here that Tristan, part of his story is deeply tragic because he meets the future fiance of his uncle before they become an item. And he promises to take her back and to wed her to his uncle, who is the king of their empire. And unbeknownst to him and to her, they accidentally drink this love potion by the fault of somebody else. So they fall madly in love with one another, and it's completely outside of their control, and it winds up ruining the rest of their lives. So these deeper backstories, which I'll talk about for our other characters in a moment, should help us to understand that it's not totally out of bounds that Dante would feel pity for these people. Again, we see that a number of souls find themselves here in this circle of hell. And this, again, is to help, in a sense, identify for the reader exactly how easy it is to wind up in hell, right? It's not something that Dante paints as an impossibility for everyone. And then finally, we see that Dante continues to look on this flock of souls coming by, and he notices, and Virgil's going to tell him that many of these people were knights and ladies of antiquity, meaning of ancient times. And this should particularly raise our attention because in our discussion of courtly love, a lot of those relationships revolved around the love of knights for noble ladies. And so it's interesting here that we see so many of these people who would have been figures in courtly love tales winding up in the second circle of hell, meaning, right, that Dante is giving that commentary on the original version of courtly love as this romantic love. Because remember, we talked about how Dante shifts away from that particular focus, and instead he creates a courtly love that is more dependent on spiritual details or aspects rather than purely the romantic. And then here we see that Dante completely abandons the advice of Minos, and he is going to allow his pity to overcome him. And this is important to note because the rest of Canto V, then, we're going to read from a different perspective, understanding that Dante has already positioned his heart emotionally to feel sympathy and empathy for these figures. Coming then to the last bit of that table we're going to fill out. We come first to Cleopatra, and we see that her particular sin, right, is this love relationship she has not just with one man, but with two in particular. Helen of Troy, and her sin, what winds her up here, is the fact that she leaves her husband, and Dante pins her as the one responsible for the entirety of the Trojan War. And again, here's where we can have some pity, because depending upon the version of the tale that we listen to, it wasn't entirely Helen's choice to be taken by Paris, right? Remember, she is gifted to him from Aphrodite herself, so not an act of choice, perhaps, that she makes. The next figure we see here is Achilles, and one of the reasons why we can feel pity for Achilles is because throughout the entire Iliad, he shows a complete lack of the ability to love something other than war and his own personal glory. But here, finally, we see that he's able to give his heart away to someone, and it winds him up in the second circle of hell. Again, we turn to Paris, and we see, right, perhaps a little less pity for him. If we were putting ourselves in Dante's shoes, maybe we'd place the whole cycle of many evil years thing on him instead. But he winds up here because of him taking Helen away from her husband. And then finally we come to Tristan, who is this noble knight from medieval tales. And he, remember, falls in love with his uncle's wife, and that their love, in fact, is not initially entirely in their control. They're being manipulated by outside magical forces. That's going to be it for video number 9. So in our next video, we're going to continue with our discussion of Canto V, particularly coming to one figure who Dante would have been very familiar with. And just a reminder, make sure you do go down before you watch each video to the link on lesson to download those worksheets. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.